So, Jeremy, everybody's talking about tax reform these days, but what does it actually mean? What is tax reform?
Well, in its broadest definition, tax reform is simply changes to the tax code, but that's not what it means anymore. What it's come to mean in the last 30, 40 years is broadening the base, lowering rates, and simplifying the tax system. And in general, it comes about because the tax system gets more and more complicated as Congress grants tax favors to individual industries, individuals, and the tax system becomes cluttered by all of these tax expenditures, revenue provisions that reduce the effective tax rate. In other words, contract the base.
Well, you know, I don't think it's much of anything. I think that the words mean whatever people want them to mean. Republicans have one idea about what it's going to mean, and Democrats have another. And I think tax experts have a very specific idea of what tax reform should be. But I think for the most part, it means the tax system I wish we had rather than the one that we do have. And what I wish for and what you wish for, those things differ all the time.
Well, I think you're right that the term can be used to mean many different things. And certainly now it's being used as a euphemism by the different parties. You know, Dave Camp may mean something different by tax reform than what Harry Reid would mean. But I think you're wrong that it hasn't come to mean something very specific. And I think that tax reform now has become the idea of broadening the base, simplifying the system, and frankly, lowering rates. And I think that's a product of the triumph of the Republicans in the 1980s. And I think that most people, when you mention tax reform to them, those are the factors that lead into their mind. And I think it's more than sort of micro changes to the code.
I agree. There's like there's a question of scale that's implicit in tax reform. And you're certainly right that, and this is what I mean when I say that tax experts have a notion of what tax reform is. This broadening the base, lowering the rates meets our historical definition of what tax reform is. But that definition is not that old. You know, it's only, I mean, it's old for most of the people in the world, but for a historian like me, it's not old. It's only 40 or 50 years old. Before that, tax reform usually meant raising taxes on the rich. Or in a couple of key moments, it meant cutting taxes for everyone. But tax reform didn't used to mean this very specific trade of lower rates for a broader base until after World War II. And so I think it's great that experts believe in this. And in fact, as a tax expert, I believe in it. But I don't think that politically it has much resonance or much power.
What changes have led us to believe there's a chance for tax reform now?
You know, I think that the biggest thing that's happened is that two really important players in Washington decided they wanted to pursue tax reform. The chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee decided that this was their year and they were going to make a big effort at defining what tax reform is and then pursuing it in a really straightforward and energetic way. When you get those two guys on board, things really begin to happen. That's not the whole picture. It's not the only ingredients you need. But they are important enough to really give the whole movement some real energy behind it.
Do you think it's more of a legacy issue then, that each of them are trying to protect their legacy for different reasons? Baucus retiring, Camp losing his seat as Ways and Means Chair.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's genuine. I think they really are trying to make a difference.
And why do you think they've made that decision? Why are they pushing so hard right now?
Well, you know, the popular answer for that is that they're both on their way out as chairman of their committees, and I think that there's something to that. I honestly believe that they are genuinely interested in making the tax system better. They are genuinely convinced that the tax system is a mess, and they would like to do something about it. I mean, who, after working for a long time in some job, doesn't want to feel like they did something useful in it? I think that's really what's moving these guys forward, and a genuine sense of service to the country. I mean, I don't mean to sound hokey, but I think that stuff matters. So, you just a minute ago defined tax reform as this sort of bargain in which we trade a broader tax base for lower rates. And by broader tax base, what we usually mean, and at least in politics you hear it this way, we're going to close loopholes. So what are the loopholes in play right now? What are the ones that ostensibly, at least, we're going to close to pay for these lower rates?
Well, according to Max Baucus, everything is in play. He has announced a blank slate plan where all tax expenditures, all tax provisions are stripped out of the code and then added back one by one so that each one has to be justified by its various supporters. That is probably not what is being discussed because you know certain things aren't going to be completely eliminated. So what they're really talking about is trimming back individual tax expenditures. The ones that most often get mentioned are the mortgage interest deduction, but again, it has a powerful lobby behind it. You're talking about playing at the edges. You hear talk about capping deductions as a whole. Obama's talked about it, Mitt Romney even discussed it, but again, that mobilizes quite a few lobbies against you. So when Congress is talking about loopholes now, low-hanging fruit was basically wiped out by 1986. There are no particularly egregious provisions out there that everyone agrees are wasteful. Now you're talking about provisions that almost everyone agrees are important, and the only way to raise the revenue necessary to significantly lower the rates is to start trimming at those, and that's where Congress is going to run into difficulties.
A lot of these loopholes aren't really loopholes. They're things that we value. I mean, sort of like the charity deduction, which is something people talk about curbing, or some people talk about eliminating it. Extremely popular, though. You know, one of the most popular deductions, and that's true for many of these so-called loopholes. How's Congress ever going to get on board if so many of these loopholes are popular?
Well, compromise is pretty unlikely, but I do think you can see the parameters of a possible compromise. There are a lot of people who would probably be in favor of trimming the mortgage interest deduction to not include second mortgages. That is not a popular provision in Congress that it extends to that. Does that raise a lot of revenue? No. But is it possible for Congress to compromise in that way? Yes. As I said, a deduction cap actually has bipartisan support. It's been proposed by President Obama. It was proposed by Romney. It doesn't usually get anywhere in Congress, but you can kind of see a possible compromise there. If everyone sacrifices just a little bit of these tax expenditures, you might get enough revenue to start pushing rates down enough to make tax reform possible. But I think compromise is going to be difficult. I think there are a lot of entrenched interests. I think there are a lot of congressmen who are not necessarily interested in this, so why pay for it? Why pay political capital to achieve tax reform when you're not actually that interested in the outcome? So, do you think Congress can ever compromise on these tax benefits? Do you think they'll aim lower?
I think that ultimately, I think nothing will happen. But in the short term, I think we might get smaller tax reform in the sense of, you know, lower rates, but not that much lower. And in exchange for that, we'll pay for that with curbs on existing deductions rather than the elimination of them. So I don't think we're going to wipe out the mortgage interest deduction. But I think we might put new boundaries around it. You know, we already limit it. You can't buy a $10 million house and deduct the interest on the entire purchase price. I think that we might find other ways of further limiting those deductions and maybe even limiting all deductions all at once, but that's another issue.
So you think that a deduction cap, which has been a feature of 3 presidential campaigns at this point, might come back on the table in Congress?
I think that a deduction cap has the virtue of not mobilizing any one constituency to near hysteria, and instead mobilizing all constituencies to modest hysteria. So, I mean, I think that actually there's a better chance for success because one highly mobilized group of objectors can really derail the whole thing. So if you tried to go after the mortgage interest deduction specifically, you'd get the real estate agents, the real estate lobby all bent out of shape, and they would get a lot of homeowners bent out of shape, and then you've got a real sort of momentum against reform. I think by limiting all deductions together, in some broad-based way that's a little bit obscure, I think that there's a chance that everyone will be a little bit irritated, but not so much to really send the thing off the rails.
So mobilize everyone against you a little bit rather than specific groups a lot.
I know, it sounds counterintuitive, but I do think that's the way that politics usually works. It's the motivated constituencies that actually make things happen, and slightly motivated majorities often get walked all over.